yet we do everything to avoid it, don't we? We take a deep breath, put on a strong face. We stop talking and collect ourselves for a moment. We're even building cry rooms these days, so our tears don't have to be made public. I can recall on many occasions contacting a congregant a few weeks after a loss and saying to them, hey, we really miss seeing you in church. We hope you're doing okay. To which I would inevitably receive a response like, I'm sorry, I just can't come to church right now. Church makes me think of him. And no one wants to see me cry. And I can understand their concern. While it's not intentional, our own discomfort with grief causes us to judge one another's grieving. We determine when it's no longer appropriate for someone else to mourn. We have a tendency most of the time before the person is ready to say, it's time to move on. Come on. Hasn't he grieved long enough yet? Which, of course, our culture reinforces and condones too. After all, crying is something you should do in private. Getting counseling and therapy, those are only for the mentally ill. Depression's for the weak, so we whisper about it behind closed doors. Being vulnerable in general is just not something we celebrate. And so it's no wonder we don't grieve all that well. And no surprise that it has its consequences for our culture. I read recently that in the last several years, more soldiers have been killed by their own hand than by combat in the Middle East. The article went on to say that on average, 22 veterans a day are committing suicide in this country. Are we giving the people who fight for our freedom the space they need to be human when they return from conflict? Or are we asking them to move on and act as if their lives were never changed forever as a result of sending them there in the first place? But of course, it's not just soldiers. It's you and me too. All of us for different reasons, different times, and in different ways. Like infidelity, to ignore the grief over a struggling marriage. Or anger toward a family member or physician, or even God for the death of your loved one. Or immediate gratification in a purchase outside our means in order to avoid the pain of a lost job or even a lost career. Don't get me wrong, grief does not excuse any of our behaviors or our decisions. We must always take responsibility for our actions. But it's also important to know that there's almost always something else going on beneath the surface. Yes, sometimes it's a series of unfortunate coincidental events. Sometimes there may not be a reason, but sometimes we're not ourselves because every action we take is a clamor to avoid our tears. Which makes me want to believe the church is a safe place for our sorrow. That at least here we provide a space for grief, that we make room in faith for tears. And yet there seems to be a movement in recent years among many Christians that the church ought to be a place only to uplift and inspire, that faith is somehow only about feeling good and finding joy in Jesus. And while these are certainly important aspects of being church, I just worry this kind of faith reinforces our world's understanding of tears and not that of our God's. I can remember one day at a shopping mall of all places watching a mother say to her crying child, "Can I have a tear for my pocket?" After nodding his head, the mother rubbed her thumb across one of his lower eyelids, saturating it with brine, then plunging it deep into her pocket. I didn't really get it at the time. Why would this mother want a tear of all things? And why for her pocket? Wouldn't this tear just be absorbed or forgotten or washed away in the next load of laundry? But now, having children of my own, I realize what she was doing. recognizing the value of her son's tears was more broadly an acknowledgement of the sorrow he was experiencing and an expression of this mother's love for him. I think about that mother and her child when I think about how I imagine God to feel about our tears. Or at least this is what Scripture seems to suggest over and over again. After all, if there's anything that condones our tears, it's the Bible. It's chocked full of them. When Sarah dies, the text reads that Abraham mourns and weeps for her. When Job loses everything, sadness finds him too. Esau says to his father, Isaac, do you have only one blessing, my father? And then lifts up his head and weeps. Of course, there are the Psalms too. Oh, the Psalms are full of tears. My tears have been my food day and night, while people continually say to me, where is your God? That's a psalm. You keep track of all my sorrows. You've collected all my tears in your bottle. You've recorded each one in your book. That's a psalm. I'm worn out from my groaning. All night long I flood my bed with weeping and drench my pillow with tears. That's a psalm. There's even an entire book dedicated to grief. It's called the Book of Lamentations. It's full of poems and laments that acknowledge the sadness that the Israelites feel over the destruction of Jerusalem. And of course, we all memorized at least one Bible verse in Sunday school as children. It's known as the shortest verse in all of Scripture. Mary and Martha call for Jesus to come, for their brother Lazarus has just died, and when he arrives on the scene, John 11, verse 35 reads what? It's only natural then on a day like All Saints to hear from the one whose name we refer to as the weeping prophet, Jeremiah, who in this passage, among others, cries for the people. This morning text reads, oh, that my head is a spring of water and my eyes a fountain of tears, so that I may weep day and night. So don't let anyone ever tell you that people of faith don't cry. In fact, I sort of feel sorry for people who can't or who aren't able. I've heard of a gland disorder that actually disallows some from literally forming tears. Can you imagine what it would be like to physically not be capable of crying? After all, there are just times where it's absolutely necessary. Pittsburgh. Tears. Families separated from one another at the border. Tears. The Syrian refugee crisis. Tears. When we don't shed tears in these moments, it's not because we aren't capable. It's just that we've become experts at suppressing them. When you're told over and over again to simply live on the surface, you don't feel much anymore. You become desensitized. You see the storyline and the headlines and you think, oh God, that's terrible, and you go right on eating your dinner as if nothing ever happened. But whatever you do, especially if you have a son, don't let him do this. Don't tell him, boys, don't cry. A whole generation of men have been told by the world that they're not allowed to cry. And the damage is already done. After all, we know all too well that there's such thing as a good cry. You read a good book and you're moved with emotion. You watch a powerful film and are overwhelmed by its story. You see an Olympian on the podium, tears streaming down their face, or hear a piece by Mozart and become misty-eyed yourself. I know for each one of us, we've laughed so hard we've cried. I hope today, All Saints Sunday, is an opportunity for a good cry. I can remember on the day of my ordination, as soon as all those who had gathered there around me laid hands on me and the regional minister began to pray, sobs, uncontrollable sobs, just came over me. From a place to this day I still don't quite understand. You see, there's something healing, no matter the reason, from releasing our tears. There's something liberating about crying. In fact, I think it's the gift that God gives us to let it out, to let go of that which lies beneath the surface, whatever we might carry deep in the depths and dark corners of our inner selves. Jeremiah asks, is there no balm in Gilead? And then he begins to cry. I don't know for sure, but I suspect he discovered that day what you and I already know to be true, that there is a balm in each of us. It's the God-given healing power of our tears, and not just those we shed for ourselves, but even more important, those we shed with and for one another. At least those are the tears that Jeremiah is shedding, and those he suggests are simultaneously streaming down the face of God. You see, Jeremiah is not crying for himself, but for the people. It's okay to cry for our own benefit, but we also need to shed tears of empathy and sympathy and compassion. This last Monday night, 13 of us from this congregation and hundreds of others from our greater community gathered at Congregation or Hadash for a prayer vigil and service of healing for the victims of the mass shooting that took place at Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh last weekend. Jews, Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, black, white, Asian, Indian, we all gathered together, read names and flamed candles and shed tears because that's what you do as people of faith. In fact, we shed tears together, if nothing else, as a reminder, as Paul says, that we do not grieve without hope. We grieve with God and a community of faith who are there to pick us up, embrace us, love us, and even carry us when all we can do is muster tears. You know, at every graveside service at which I've ever presided, I read from the book of Revelation. Those familiar words you all know. God will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be an end to death, and to mourning, and to crying, and to pain. For the old order will have passed away. My friends, that day is coming. But we're not there yet. And so in the meantime, the answer to Jeremiah's question is yes. There is a balm. It's been there all along. You just need to dig beneath the surface and roll away that stone where you buried it long, long ago. And when you do, you find the joy does come in the morning. That there is a promised land. And that the tomb really is empty.